Welcome to the Art of Remembering. Today we're going to be exploring Jungian Psychology. We're going to be exploring my best understanding of his method, of his practice, and my understanding of this, my own integration of this in a sense. I like to start with a disclaimer that I'm not an expert in anything. I come from my own understanding. I'm thinking thoughts about the thoughts of others, and that's what I can move forward with. That's what I can talk about, is those thoughts, those experiences, those feelings. And so from that place, here we go. So Jung, to my best estimation of it, wanted to create a modern process of myth making, a modern process of meaning making within a world that has largely fallen away from the old forms. Today we look to economies, we look to commerce, we look to sensationalism and production, and what we don't look to is the spiritual side of our own selves, the religious side of our own selves, which Jung often related to the old Latin, which, excuse my pronunciation, the old French, I believe, relegare. It's a linking back. It's a linking back to the past, our past selves, the old world, if you will. And what he aspired to do was create a system by which we could differentiate ourselves from the modern world, from the collective requirements of our being, from even religion itself, in a sense, as I see it. And so within that, he founded what is now termed analytical psychology, or depth psychology, which is the exploration of the depths. And he separated himself from Freud, who was really the first person who looked to explore, to categorize, to discover the depths of the human psyche, and who looked to the unconscious, and looked to dreams, and looked to fantasies, to shed some light on what the hell it is we're doing here. And so where Jung separated himself, as many will probably know, Freud was very sexually driven through the Oedipal complex, through our daily leftovers. That's what he believed the unconscious was. That which we wish to repress from ourselves was the sum total of our unconscious. And Jung looked to the legacy of mythology, of philosophy, of religion, and felt that this fell short of explaining the totality of human experience, the totality of human expression, the totality of human creativity. And so then it aspired and was inspired to explore that, to act as a cartographer of the unconscious, and to create for people, as I said, a modern system of myth making and meaning making for the human being of today. And so within that, the best place to begin is where we all, within the Jungian system, and again, these are Jung's ideas on the psyche, and I've found some synchronicity with them. I've found some harmony with them, and in other places, not as much, but we're exploring Jung's ideas here. And so let's delve into it. And the beginning of our journey into the psyche, as Jung sees it, is with the persona. And the persona it's how we all interact with the world. It's the membrane through which our psyche, our internal world, our subjective world, the world of us as a subject, interacts with the objective world. And because on a day-to-day basis, we're faced with people, we're faced with situations, we're faced with institutions, particularly institutions that are collectivized in a sense. We have to pay our taxes. We have to go to work. We have to use the jargon of our business experience. These are collectivized experiences. And in that sense, our persona is a collectivized experience. We take on what adaptive mechanisms we learn to interact and interface and move through the world, and we turn this into a persona, which comes from the Greek, which was the mask that actors would wear when they were in dramatic performances. So the persona in that sense is the mask that we wear such that we're not found out, that we're a part of the performance in the world, that we're acting our part in the play of humanity. And so what Jung looked to was that these are ultimately collective elements, these are not individual elements. And so how do we begin to generate meaning on an individual level? And what does it mean to generate meaning on an individual level? And what's the process of delving through our own unconscious, as seen through myth, as seen through philosophy, as seen through culture and through play and through art, such that we can express ourselves as individuals? And this is what Jung termed individuation. And so individuation is precisely that. It's taking us out of these collective elements that we use to interface with the world, and finding that which is true in and of ourselves. That by understanding the collective elements of ourselves, the collective complexes of ourselves, and the archetypes that underlay them, that we can then come to a closer, at least approximation, of who it is we are and how it is we wish to express ourselves and what it is we have to offer within that individuated process of the world. So it's a differentiation of ourselves. It's a maturation of who we are, in the sense that we're separate. As children, we're in a state of non-differentiation between us and our mother. There's no separation. We look to her and we haven't figured out how to separate the experience of others from the experience of ourselves. That's when you play the peekaboo game with children. You peekaboo and you tell them to hide, they'll just cover their face because they haven't figured out how to, that them not being able to see something means that other people can still see it. This is a foreign concept. So we're in this undifferentiated space where we can't tell that other people see the world differently from us. And so through this art of individuation, we're finding that sense of ourself to realize that that's that which we are not blind to, that which we are blind to is not necessarily that which the world is blind to. And that how we move through our own processes isn't necessarily how the world moves through its own processes. And finding the power and the acceptance of ourselves in how we can move forward through that as ourself and as our own individuated being and as something not separate but as its own self-reliant part of the continuum of human experience. And ultimately, this is the heroic responsibility of every person within their life, within their experience of being. And this is what Jung, I believe, shows, particularly in the Symbols of Transformation, his fifth collected work, that this is the essence of the heroic process, that we follow ourselves down into the depths of our own being and come back something renewed. That we come back something that was other than we were before, because we have passed through the dark waters of ourself and emerged, in a sense, baptized and reborn into what we really are. And so with that, it seems timely to me that we begin to talk about libido and the sense of the libido, which is psychic energy. In Freud's view, this was something that was driven by sexual fantasy, that was driven by repression, that the Oedipal complex, yes, or penis envy, that either you have a dick and you want to fuck your mom with it, or you don't have a dick and you wish you did so you could fuck your mom with it. In Jung's view, this was not adequate for expressing the totality of human experience. That Freud's analysis that everything went from mouth and sustenance to sexuality and groin to anus and excretion couldn't account for the works of Michelangelo, couldn't account for the myth-making process of Homer, couldn't account for the wars and for the triumphs and for the sorrow of humanity, that there was something more to it. And so he began to look into myths, and he found that libido is our creative aspect. It's our fire, it's our drive, it's what seeks to replicate itself in a strictly biological sense. It's that we all have a desire to replicate in some way. For the worm, its libidinal aspect is very simple. It delves through the earth, it eats whatever worms eat. I'm not sure, it's bacteria or mycelium. And when it rains, it comes to the surface, but it replicates itself. And everything it does is to carry on the passage of its genes. Now, as humans, we have a much more abstract system of symbol making, of living, because we are the biological inheritors of the system of the worm, of the system of the slime mold, of the system of the snail and the cephalopod. And so within that, we direct our libido towards more abstract ends. We direct it towards culture. We direct it towards money. We direct it towards status. Within that, we create symbols. And this is the essence of symbol formation. This is the essence of humans moving their symbol into ritual, into ceremony, into cultural artifacts, where we may not think of it this way, but in an extremely abstract way, when we're clicking on a keyboard and we're filling in an expense report, or we're writing an email, we're utilizing symbols in such a way that it ensures that we will continue to have the sustenance that we need to procreate and recreate our being. And so in that way, I'm reducing it to a procreative and to a sustenance-driven aspect. But it's the continuum of human experience isn't quite so simple. We move outside of that, of the simple procreative method, to where a person can be asexual and still drive towards utilizing these symbols that we have created of economy, of business, of commerce, to ensure what is the architectonic movements of our own mind. And that's something very interesting. So to me, I liken the movements of libido to that of a river, that the energy of our psyche, the energy of our unconscious is like the flowing water, and it moves down in a river, and it creates tributaries as it goes down. It creates offshoots of the river that act as the river itself, but that are in a different way. And eventually the river flows to the sea. And from the sea, it's then evaporated, it's brought up by the sun, it's moved across continents, it's moved across the planet, and it falls back down again as a purified object onto the tops of mountains, onto floodplains, et cetera, and creates the rivers anew. And this is the regression, if we can call it that, of the libido down into the fundamental parts of the unconscious, moving out to the sea, and through the heat and through the drive of the self, this self-organized mechanism that we'll get to, it evaporates, it moves up, and it falls back down as little raindrops, which I see as symbols. It's these symbols, and the symbols are, within Jung's view, the symbols are a system of portraying more information than can be portrayed linguistically. They carry with them something greater and something more numinous than what can simply be expressed through, well, conventional means. So the cross, for instance, it's an orienting symbol. It points to the four directions. But to a person who's Christian, it also represents the resurrection, and whatever that subjectively means for them. It represents the passion of the Christ, and whatever that passion means for them within their own lives. These are not only linguistic tools, but they're also emotional tools. They're also affective tools. They have an affect on us. They move us to do different things. And this is differentiated by Jung from the sign, which is something that is bound, that is something that is known. When you see a stop sign, it's not, oh my God, there's this numinous power in front of me that, I can scarcely wrap the fringes of my consciousness around it. It's no, it means to stop. And similarly, when a person wears a cross, it can bear both the sign and the symbol. It can be a sign that they are in fact a Christian and they follow the way of Christ, but it's also a symbol that there's a meaning in their life that drives them behind the cross that is bigger than the immediate sign that they are a Christian. Maybe, of course, there's different kinds of Christians. But within that, we begin to see that the libido moves primarily non-linguistically, and it moves visually, it moves auditorially, it moves somatically within our bodies, such that we're getting more information than what can be even immediately rationally expressed. That's not to say it can't be rationally expressed over time, but it compels us in such a way, and it carries more information with it than in what is readily apparent. And so from there, we'll explore what are the functions through which, in a sense, what are the physics through which the libido expresses itself within the unconscious? What is it through which it comes into being? And it's appropriate to start with the complexes. And so what is a complex? A complex is, to keep with our river analogy, a complex is when the river separates itself from the main river. We have the main river and it's winding down, and the river separates itself along the way. And these happen at affective events within our life. So when something significant happens within our life, we form a complex around it. Whether we do this necessarily or not, I'm not a psychological expert. I can't say. To the best of my understanding, this is these complexes, as we go through life, call into themselves their own constellation. They are their own constellated elements. They draw their own energy to them. And in a sense, which is what's very interesting, and Jung talks about this in his Tavistock lectures, the complexes take on a personality of their own. And they have almost a psyche in and of itself. And it's their own relationship to the psyche that they draw into them that is, in a sense, in competition with the ego. It can be. Ideally, it's not. But that as we drive ourselves through our lives, there are events that we take on that the adaptive mechanisms that we formed up to that point, the sort of breadth of the river, if you will, aren't enough to contain what it is we're taking on. And maybe there's already a preformed natural tributary, a natural branch that our psychology can take, that our energy can take. And so we move down that, and what holds the complex together is its feeling tone. So when we go off that main river and we go down that side passage, there's a different feeling tone to it. Maybe the canyon walls are higher, maybe the canyon walls are lower, and we're on an open plain. And this speaks to the fact that a complex isn't necessarily a negative thing. We tend to speak in our society of, a mother complex or a father complex, or things that are very negative, or can be negative, I should say. But they're not necessarily negative, but they possess within themselves their own feeling tone, and that is the energy, that's the libido, that's the surface tension of the water that holds them together, is the feeling of the complex. And we know these are becoming present in our own lives when we feel that we're just not quite ourselves. Perhaps somebody references something unbeknownst to them that triggers an event within us that reminds us of something in the past, and suddenly we're acting in a way that we generally wouldn't think of ourselves to act, whether it's rage, whether it's sadness, whether it's uncontrollable laughter. These are the areas where we know that a complex can be at work, is that the feeling tone of that complex is now, because of the event, the triggering event in our lives has gathered what it needed to become conscious. It's gathered the energy that it needed to move from the unconscious mind and into the conscious mind and into our overall awareness. And this is an aspect of the complex, is that in a sense, for a time, it can become like a Venn diagram of the ego. If you think of the ego as a circle and the complex as a circle, there can be an overlap of the two elements. And within that overlap is the anger, is the sadness, is the laughter, is the dread. And seeing those complexes and honoring them and respecting that they are a part of ourselves and that they're not necessarily always something we can directly integrate into our personality is a part of the aspect of individuation. To respect that some things are in their place for a reason, and that they're there to protect us ultimately for a reason, because this is something Jung talks about at length, is that the psyche seeks a state of equilibrium, that it seeks to heal itself, that it seeks to protect itself. And so it's not that the complexes, even though the complexes can become something that is not positive and wreaks havoc on our lives, especially if it possesses us, that originally it was built out of a desire to protect us, out of a desire to reach a state of equilibrium. And to me, this is very important in my own life to understand that there's a holistic nature to the psyche, that there's a desire for equilibrium, there's a desire for understanding and for protection of one's own self, and that if the complexes are acting out in such a way that it is destructive to that nature, it's because we are not listening to them. In Greek, there's an ancient word called daemon, which in Latin, let me start with daemon. The daemon was a sort of protective spirit over a person. It was a personal protective spirit that people took with them throughout their life. And now the Latin term for this is genius. And so a person's genius was actually the spirit that found them and protected them throughout their life. However, if you don't listen to your genius, if you don't listen to your daemon, it will very well become a demon, and it will very well seek to destroy you until you get the fucking message. And whether or not there's any ignoring that in my own life, I found that there's absolutely not. I've through the course of my own life, discovered that I will actually absolutely destroy my own life until I fucking figure my shit out. And in a way, this is the power of the complexes, is that when they're listened to, when they're honored, when they're given space at the fire to tell their piece, then we can hear their story, then we can listen to the event, then we can look to the archetype that lies at the center and is the central constellated event that has formed the complex in and of itself, and we can give that voice and we can give it understanding, so that at least when it arises within our life, we possess it and it does not possess us. And so when we say we possess it, now let's talk about what we mean by we, which is the ego. which is the sense of self. In Greek, this is ego. It's I, it's me, it's who I am, it's what I am. It's the thing that gives me a sense of self, and ultimately it's the central complex of the conscious mind. It's, in terms of a river, it is the central flow of the Nile River, opposed to all the branches, and all the branches return to the ego. So the ego, in our culture, we put a lot of weight on having a small ego, which isn't necessarily healthy for dealing with the overall onslaughts of the unconscious and onslaughts of the complexes. Because if our ego is too small, well then, if there's a complex that's bigger than it, well suddenly that's the main river and that's the main flow. And we are no longer, as Freud said, the masters of our own house. Really, we're never the masters of our own house, but we'll get more to that further on in the video. So the ego it's formed through our interactions with our parents, it's formed through our interactions with our friends, it's formed through our interactions with our culture, and it's the thing that gives us a sense of self. When you say, I am me, I am you, whoever you are, that's your ego talking. And there's something very important in that that's not to be discarded simply as something toxic, because ultimately it's not toxic. To have a sense of self is not a toxic thing. It's a very strong thing, and we live in a very ego-driven culture. The ego, by its nature, desires a singularity. It desires answers that can be easily explained because it's something that it can grasp. It's something that it can hold on to. It's something that it can bound itself around, that it can not only keep in its orbit, but that it can draw to the surface of its planet, if we're to look at the ego as a celestial body. And so the ego's not huge on polarity. And this is something that's very difficult because the unconscious, the collective unconscious, our personal unconscious is rife with polarities. Life itself is rife with polarities. I've often said that black and white are the edges of our visible spectrum. But what exists in between black and white is every single color under the sun. Our entire lives are lived as a kaleidoscope of black and white, as a collage of the space in between black and white, the space in between singularities. And there's a beauty in that. And so this process of coming to terms with the ego, as I understand it, is allowing it to keep its place. Yes, it's the central complex of the conscious mind. It's not the central force of our psyche. It's merely the central force that drives us into the world, and aligning it with an idea that respects our own myth-making process, our own meaning-making process, our own mythology as we've found it through the process of active imagination, the process of perhaps psychedelics, the process of living. This is what gives our ego the fortitude and the resilience and the ability to bend rather than break when confronted with situations outside of its purview, with paradoxes outside of its purview, and with a spectrum outside of its immediate ability to understand. And so as we're talking about the ego's inability to understand, we should move on from here, it seems to me, to the shadow and to the Jungian idea of the shadow. And what the shadow is, as I see it, is the shadow is that which we wish we were not. And I'll say that again. The shadow is that which we wish we were not. It's not that which we are not. It's that which we wish we were not. It's these parts of ourselves which we would rather repress than make conscious within the central complex, because it's easier for us to repress it. For Bruce Banner, his shadow is the Hulk. His shadow is the unquenchable rage at his own academic process and his loss of Betty Ross and yada, yada, yada. That he would rather not confront, and in fact he goes to great lengths in the comic books to not confront it. Jekyll and Hyde is another example. Now what's interesting is that the shadow is not necessarily negative, because when Bruce Banner is transformed into the Hulk, well, the Hulk's shadow is Bruce Banner, because Bruce Banner is that which the Hulk wishes he was not. He's weak and puny Banner. He's intellectual. He uses his mind to solve things rather than just his self-righteous rage and his unconquerable strength. And so when we look at the shadow, we have to realize that it's things that we are that we'd rather not be. And it's things that we might like to, well, put into the shadow of ourselves. If we think of ourself as a being shining on us and giving us direction and giving us forward momentum in our life, our shadow is what's behind us, and there's always a shadow. There's always a thing we wish that we would rather not recognize, and it is both a complex and an archetype that is at play in our lives constantly. And to integrate it, we have to be able to see it directly, and the shadow, by its nature, likes to hide itself, and the primary medium through which it does this is through projection. It projects itself onto other things. We see, oh, I see this in that person, and I really don't like that. It's not to say that everything we don't like is a projection of our shadow. That's simply not the case, but sometimes there's just assholes in the world and you can't do anything about that. And maybe that's a part of our shadow. That's a broader topic than I care to explore, because I like to think that there's assholes. It's easier for me. That the shadow puts itself onto other people that which we don't wish to look at in ourselves. It puts onto others what we hope to not have to integrate, what we hope to not have to take possession of. It's much easier for us to seemingly let it possess another person than it is to realize that it either has some possession over us, or even worse, that we might have to take possession over it. And within this is an enormous aspect of the art of integration, and the art of individuation, as I see it, is separating our projections from their objective view and taking them back in as subjective things, as subjective phenomenon, which we're hoping to bring to the fore in our life, because there's energy in them. When we project it onto somebody else, we're projecting a certain degree of our libido onto another person. We're, in a sense, giving away a part of our power as an individual to the other person, out of the desire to not have to recognize that that power is actually our own, because it's a part of our power that's distasteful to us. It's a part of our power that might be disgusting to us. And in this sense, there's a hint of what Jung would call the treasure that is hard to attain. It's why the Knights of the Round Table, when they had to go into the forest, each went into the forest into the part that was darkest to them. It's why in a dream you might have to go into the sewer, into the toilet, into the belly of the whale, in order to find the truth of yourself that is beneath the muck and the shit and the piss that we don't want to recognize, but that is constantly playing a role in our lives through our projections, and then through our, let's say, injections into ourself, once we've even removed it from the projections, until we integrate it, until we take possession of it as a part of ourself. Jung's view is that we can never fully be all of ourselves, because it's like a distant satellite that's out of our orbit. It's out of our possession. It's not acting towards the individual's self-directed process of moving throughout their life. And so it separates the individual from moving the direction of their life in the direction that they would seek their life to go. And from embodying themselves, with a capital S, selves, as an individual within the world, rather than a collectivized element, rather than as half of themselves, of that which only reaches the light, because half of us is always within the shadow, and that half of us is often relegated to the personal unconscious. In Freud's view, this would be the Oedipal complex, or whatever sort of taboos lie beneath the surface of our own consciousness. And so what is this self that we're looking towards? And the self is the unifying symbol of our entire consciousness. It's what lies at the center. Its iconography is that of the mandala. It's that of the circle. It's that of the wholeness. It's that of the planet, in a way, that the planet is entirely contained self. It's a body in and of itself that lies not within our conscious mind, but in a sense between the personal and the collective unconscious. It is the aligning function that is in between us and incalculable, unintegratable contents within our own collective unconscious mind. It's what's found within the archetype of the divine child, whether it's Jesus, it's Horus, it's Mithras. Before the 12 labors of Hercules, he's in the position of aligning himself around the ego, but through the 12 labors, which Hercules being a solar hero, he goes through his 12 labors, which are the 12 signs of the zodiacs, and through that he constellates himself around his self with a capital S by aligning the cosmos around him, in a sense, but not the objective cosmos, but his own internal cosmos. There's a degree of projection and counter-projection here, transference and counter-transference, that our psyche is, in a sense, our internal projection of the world around us. And a conversation can be had that the world around us is then a projection of the internals of our psyche into the world around us. So through this, Hercules is finding himself, and in the end, he becomes a divine hero. He becomes constellated in the stars. He becomes a thing eternal, because the self is the eternal symbol of our own psyche. It's the eternal symbol that lies at the center of what we are. It's a thing which aligns us to ourself, and finding the proper ego-self axis, as Jung would call it, the proper degree of not only separation but of integration and communication between the ego and the self, is this art of individuation, because we cannot come closer to ourselves when our libido is separated into unconscious projections. We cannot come to the art and the reality of ourself when our libido is distally located within our complexes without their proper communication to us. These are guides to ourself. Jung called the complexes the via regia, the royal highway into the unconscious, because they are what give us the signposts, or maybe more accurately, the symbol posts within ourselves to find our own self. And we certainly are not at it in our persona, in the collectivized vision of how we interact with reality. We have to move inward through our own myth-making process, through our own regression into the soul, in order to find what is the form principle, what is the central archetype of our own being. Not of the world's being, not of a collectivized vision of humanity, but what is the form principle of our own being? What is that archetype? And to speak on the archetypes for just a moment so that we can clarify the point, the archetypes are they're like the principles of erosion that guide the river of our libido, that guide the river of our ego and of our complexes. They are the bedrock or the sand that underlie it. They're what direct it. Is there a canyon that was formed before? Is there a valley that was formed before by past transits of libido, because ultimately we are a part of a human legacy, and not only a human legacy, but a mammalian legacy and a biological legacy, a primate legacy. And so the archetypes are not only our own movements, but they're the movements of the people that came before us. So when we speak of the archetype of the mother as, say, being something nurturing, that's not only the functions of our own mother or even of human mothers, but it's how many children have suckled at the teat of cats or rats or primates or whatever it is that came before us, that has formed this preformed valley of what it means to have a relationship between mother and child, or father and child, or society and child, or culture and child. So there are cultural archetypes, there are societal archetypes, these are the formative principles that underlie how our libido flows through our ego complex, through our complexes as a whole. And that's why I say the complex has as its center an archetype, because it's the canyon through which the complex has now perhaps broken a dam into, or in our modern time of unprecedented industrialism and information age and consumerism, we may be forming new archetypes, we may be forming new canyons. This is a much broader conversation for another video. But it's a very interesting subject to question what will be left down to our ancestors and to the people 50,000 years from now. What new archetypes will we leave behind as a formative principle for the direction of their libido and for their complexes and for their ego, and what's the culture that we're going to leave behind for the future? Because by that same principle, the people of 100,000 years ago left this for us, and they left a record of it through myth, through storytelling, through theater, through ceremony, through ritual. A myth is something like the collective dreams of 1,000 lives. It's not the dream of one person, it's a dream that has been handed down and in a sense peer-reviewed and sourced by the collective experience of all the people who told that myth from then on. So in the vein of communicating with our ancestors through our collective dreams, through our myth, through our descent into the collective unconscious, we now have to come face to face with the anima and the animus, which is the psychopomp. It's the guide into the unconscious. Hermes in Greek mythology would guide the souls of the dead. This is the Valkyrie in Nordic mythology that would guide the souls of the dead into Valhalla, into Folkvangud, into Hades. And the anima is our guide into our own underworld, into our own realm of the spirits, into our own realm of the ancestors, which is our own unconscious. It's the pathways laid down before us. It's the archetypal forms. It's the archetypal formative principles that were laid down by every life that came before us, from the time of worms and bacteria and slime molds and cephalopods until now. And so the anima, in Jung's view, the anima for a man is a woman. It's the animus for a woman, which in Greek means wind. Make of that what you will. In a woman, it's the man because it's what the woman is not. And so the psyche takes on the form of balance for what the woman in her conscious identity is not. She takes on unconsciously as the man. For what the man consciously does not express himself as, the psyche takes on unconsciously as the anima. And so there's a sense of, to explore our own depths, we have to a degree take on that which we are not. We have to be willing to accept the polarity of our own being. This is the yin and the yang, that within the white there is a little black, and within the black there is a little white, that life is again occurring within those polarities. And so to explore ourselves, we have to be willing to open ourselves up to that polarity. And to travel within ourselves, we have to open up to, even as fundamental as our gender expression is, we have to be willing to open up to the direction of a different gender expression. Now, this was written in a time before modern gender theory. I'm not going to make comments on the efficacy or the truth to it based on modern gender theory, because frankly I don't know as much about it as Jungian psychology. One day I hope to. Perhaps I'll make a video on that in the future. In fact, I hope to. But for now, we're going to stick with this form, that to journey through the unconscious, there's a hieros gamos, which is a divine union. This is an alchemical process of, it's the chemical wedding for those who know a little of their alchemical history, that we have to marry those parts of ourselves which we do not believe ourselves to be, with those parts of ourselves which we know that we are. And through this process, we come to a greater knowledge of ourself, with a capital S, as Jung saw it, and we come to a better expression of ourselves for what we really are within the world, not as we have been taught to be, not as we even necessarily believe ourselves to be, but as that which we really are. And within that process of delving into the unconscious, as I've read it and as I understand it, there is a final figure within this video that we're going to meet, which is that of the Great Mother, of the Great Sea, when the river reaches the ocean again and plumbs incalculable depths, plumbs incalculable diversity of life. There's nowhere more foreign intelligences to our own than in the depths of the ocean. Nowhere is there more alien experiences of our own than in the depths of the ocean. And this is the legacy of our total collective unconscious, as Jung expresses it, that there is a place that we reach where the symbols and the signs and the intensity of the energy is almost unassimilable. We're going to work with that. And this in Sumerian mythology, in the Anima Elish in Babylonian mythology, let's say, this is Tiamat, which translates to the Great Salt Sea. This is she who gave birth to the gods, but also who sought to destroy the gods, who sought to consume the gods. There is both a creation and a consumption, that when we reach this level, there's a great danger, because it is a part of our heroic journey to be consumed by the Great Mother, to be consumed by our collective unconscious, such that we can light our fire within its depths and find a new state of meaning on the other side of lighting that fire, to bring a new reality back to, you can say our society, but to ourselves, from those depths of meaning. And that this is a process that it's my belief that we don't only reach one time in our life. There's not I hit rock bottom and then I'm done. We live within a series of narrative cycles in which the bottom of that narrative cycle occurs within the belly of the Great Mother, within the uterus, within the matrix of the Great Mother. And it's interesting to note that the word for mother comes from the Latin mater, which I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's the same word that we get matter from, and it comes from the Greek word mitris, which is the matrix. It's the root word for matrix, but it also means uterus. So we have to descend back into our own depths, into our own uterus, and be reborn as a child once again. This is the baptism. This is the act. This is the archetype of the child who is died, goes to hell, regresses himself, and is reborn into society as a God man or God woman. This is central to the art of individuation. This is what Jung discovered through his symbols of transformation. And as he said himself, he discovered the secrets of myth, and then through his red books and his black books, he endeavored to discover what his own myth was, because he realized that he had discovered the keys to myth within society, but had not discovered his own myth within himself. And between 1913 and 1916, he then, through his own imaginative process, descended into his own depths and emerged with what then became analytical psychology, psychological types, the fundamentals of analytical psychology, the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the Psychology and Alchemy. His collected works from then on all came from this foundation of the process that he found through his own myth-making process and his own active imagination and his own descent into the depths of himself, not of the culture. In fact, reading the Red Book, he wound up askew of much of what his culture had been up to that point. He found himself at a loss and at a feeling of insanity for the polarity to the tension of the opposites, to, as he would say, the enantiodromia of himself, the spirit of the times, and the spirit of the depths. And this was what then bore the fruit of the art of individuation as he continued to study in the most empirical way that he could. Jungian psychology is not necessarily the most empirical thing, but the subject matter is of such a depth and of such an intensity that it's very hard to find the empirical metrics through which we could measure, say, the descent of this psychological mind into insanity and back again, as it's portrayed through myth cross-culturally throughout time. This is a very difficult thing to find empirical and measurements that can be extrapolated across each other, because it's quite literally the water that we're swimming in. So within that, I thought we would end with a small myth from ancient Greece to explore some of the concepts that we've seen, to explore the process of Jungian analysis through myth. And so what this myth will be is the myth of Orestes. And I haven't made a great study of this myth, but I'm going to do the best that I can with the knowledge that I have. And so Orestes was the son of Agamemnon, and when Agamemnon left for Troy to call in great winds, he sacrificed his daughter to, I believe, the goddess Artemis, to call in winds so that he would have an easy time getting to Troy, let's say. And while he was gone, his wife took on a lover who, upon Agamemnon's return, murdered him. And so Orestes was absent at the time, and when he finally returned, he swore an oath to avenge his father, and he murdered his mother in the process of this, in coming to terms with the death of his father. And as soon as he murdered his mother, he was plagued by the Furies, by the three scions of Hades and of the underworld. And now in Greek and in the Homeric tradition, the Furies are called the Erenies, which in more modern Greek more directly translates to remorse. And so we can see here the Orestes has been confronted with a complex whose feeling tone, whose constellated feeling tone is that of remorse, and he's being driven by his remorse, and he's being pestered and harassed and torn apart by his remorse. And so Orestes then goes to Delphi at the direction of Apollo. From Delphi, he addresses the Delphic oracle. He goes from there to Athena, his home city, and he addresses the council at Athena, and he's judged, and they make a vote on whether he should live or die for his matricide. And Athena herself, the goddess, is the deciding vote in a tiebreaker that decides that Orestes should live, and that to appease the Erenies, they should erect a shrine for them so that they can be worshipped. And the Erenies then convert themselves from remorse into the Eumenides, which I can't remember what the actual translation is, but what the parts of the word broken down mean is the good hate. So it goes from remorse into something positive, which is the good hate. It's the hate that drives oneself to do better. So, looking at these parts of the Homeric story, we have the Erinyes as this feeling-toned complex of remorse driving him through a regression into the underworld, consulting with the Delphic oracle at the behest of Apollo, who is very much so a symbol of the self, in that he is the symbol of the sun. He's that which we revolve around. He's that which shines. But he has to descend into the underworld to speak to an oracle who, by all accounts, gained her oracular power from the breath of the dying python, the dying snake, the dying goddess symbol of the earth that Apollo had defeated at Delphi. And from there traveled to the city, which in and of itself, because of its walled nature, Jung attributes to a kind of symbolism of the self, is subjected to his own internal judge and his own internal his complex is in a sense, but his own sense of right and wrong, his own morality, with Athena as the divine judge and the divine psychopomp, the Anima in her aspect as the adjudicator of the psyche, decided that he should live, and that the proper course of action was to integrate the Erinyes into the personality, was to integrate them into the self and transform them through their respect into a shrine that took them from being remorse into good hate. So this is the Homeric tradition. In the plays of Euripides, the Erinyes, the Eumenides, are not here placated, and Orestes then has to move into the woods, into the unconscious of the soul, and here to capture the statue of Artemis and bring it back to Athens, to bring back the soul of the wild feminine, the totem is more accurate, of the wild feminine. And here he confronts the priestesses and priests of Artemis, who are bound to sacrifice all intruders and all strangers. And so he's laid upon the sacrificial table. He's about to be sacrificed by a priestess, when the priestess and he in turn realize that the priestess about to sacrifice him is his sister. And from then they conspire to capture the statue of Artemis, to bring it back to Athens together. And from there, the Erinyes are placated. And so what this continuation of the myth, as I interpret it from a Jungian perspective, is that he has to delve even further into the unconscious, into the unknown, into the forest, that wild place that has not been touched by human industry. He confronts there a series of complexes and people that are entirely foreign to him, and will in fact sacrifice his ego self for the unconscious, that have no desire for the simplicity and for the domination of the ego. And he finds there the dynamic and living spirit of his sister, that is his Anima. It is his Anima not as it's expressed through Athena, not as it's expressed through Artemis, but as it's a real and lived function within his own personal unconscious. And together, she directs him through the unconscious as a priestess of the mysteries of the unconscious, to capture the statue of Artemis, who's related to the bear and the great wild mother, and bring it back to the city of Athens. So here we have the Anima in a threefold aspect, as the wise adjudicator, as the mistress of the wild unconscious, and as the dynamic and living personification of our own personal unconscious, as it directs us into the greater unconscious of the woods. And so within that, we have a look at the initiatory power of myth. We have a look at what Jung was looking to as he strove to understand the unconscious and understand these parts of ourselves. And how in turn we can look to these myths and look to our ancestors and look to the spirits of the land that came before us to create something new of our world, to create something new of ourselves, and through ourselves, the world. So I want to thank you very much for making it this far. I want to wish you a good morning, evening, afternoon, or good night, wherever you find yourself. Thank you for watching. This has been The Art of Remembering.